Come back down here, Ken, to my weld pool here. Welding off of your weld pool does a couple of different things. You can see this is obviously thicker. Your weld pool is standing up over top of the panel. Now this is particularly important when maybe you're welding a floor pan to a floor brace. For instance, let's look at this. This is a thicker gauge. This is a 14 gauge. And this is my 20 gauge against a 14 gauge. So with these magnets that come with the welding table, by the way, we're going to set things in place here. And I'm just going to walk through a repair here and pretend that, that I'm doing a frame rail repair or sheet metal or a floor pan onto a torque box in an old Mustang or something. Yeah. And gravity still works. So here we are, welding set. Now it's set to the same metal gauge thickness as I started out on 20 gauge because basically I'm still using 20 gauge. Now welding from the 20 to the 14, hold on, I've got to get my exercise in gravity here. We'll clean that up real quick. You can see that, you know, it's fusing pretty well. I had a blow through here, but it was because of the gap, but it's fusing nicely. So basically it's set for 20 and not set for 14. We're going to try something different. Now what we're going to do is come off of the 14. Let's, I'm going to clamp those two guys together. Where are we at? All right. There we go. Now, back over here to the machine, I know I'm changing metal gauges. So, 16 gauge, 25, so we've got a D7. So our voltage is backed off a little bit, and we're up to 7 on our wire speed. Now helmet's down, let's burn. Okay, when you look at my welds, my tacks, I'll hold this up. Can you see that? Yeah, we can see that. Okay, these welds are nice. It's set way too hot for that 20 gauge. Why didn't I blow through like that? Because that was exactly the same setting. Why did I not blow through? I pulled off of the heavier gauge metal and drug it down, just exactly like I'm going to draw here. I went in this direction and stepped down and welded. This direction, stepped down and welded. And I drug my pool into the lighter gauge metal. That technique will allow you to weld dissimilar gauges or heavier against lighter and not blow through. So keep that one in your Rolodex. That's a nice technique to learn. I'm going to tell a story on myself. You've probably seen these guys kicking around. These are reading glasses. I don't know how many of you guys are my age, but I'm old as dirt. I've earned every year. I'm every age I've ever been. I love the age that I'm at. I like the fact that I'm going to get older still. Here's one thing that happens when you pass 40. Your eyes, they go away. And I was having a problem one day. We're setting up for one of the TV shows, and I'm going to do a demo or do a project on TV, and nothing's going right. I'm checking shielding gas. I'm checking metal thickness. I'm checking machines. I changed machines. Nothing's going right. My welds look like poo. And finally it occurred to me, I can't see. So I put my reading glasses on, and I put my welding helmet on, which goes over top of the reading glasses, and all of a sudden, the world opened up to me, and I had a string of stacked dimes that was a beautiful weld. So, you know, we all need a little bit of help every once in a while. Guys like me that are a little long in the tooth and kind of gray around the edges, keep these in mind, keep these handy. I've got these things stashed all over my shop, and I'm unembarrassed and unashamed that I need reading glasses, but the fact is, these are another tool just like, well, just like this is, just like all of the tools that I've got in front of me. They're another tool to help you do a better job of your project. So if you need reading glasses at home with a magazine, probably put some reading glasses in your welding kit. All right, one of the most common welds that you're going to run into welding sheet metal is called a butt weld. And it's very simply called that because of the fact that metal like this is going to be butted up against metal like this. Now your tendency is going to be to just put these up as tight as you can together and weld over top. But here's what happens when that happens. You can weld, your weld is going to stand up a little bit more in the first place. It's going to stand up high, and you may not get penetration all the way through. You want to make sure and do this once and do it right. So what you want is a little bit of the gap so that when that filler rod comes in, oh, that's a nice shot. That's a nice shot, Ken. When that filler rod comes in, you can see what it's doing. It's actually bridging and going in between. I'm sorry, not bridging. It's actually penetrating and going in between, and it's welding this guy to that guy with the help of the filler rod. So when you're butt welding, you want to make sure and have a gap. Here's a great tool to guarantee that correct gap. Again, what I'm showing you, look at the window below the screen, and you can see these highlighted and get them from the Eastwood Company. It's a great resource. You can see how these guys work, but look at the gap. It's a 1/16 of an inch, and it's very consistent and perfect. Now this is a 4.5 to 6 inch piece of scrap, but if you're talking about a quarter panel to where you want to gauge it just right, you want that gap. You want to keep that gap, and it keeps them, let's see if we can see that plane. It keeps them perfectly parallel, just like that. And it keeps them where one's not higher than the other, and by the time you burn this guy in, you can tack it in place, and then these can go away while you finish your weld, but it's a really nice tool to have. If you don't have those, or if you're going to order them and get them later, in the meantime, here's a cool trick. Using my magnets, 2 other pieces, what I'm going to do is just kind of set it by eye, which is okay, but you know, you want to calibrate it somehow. So I'm going to set a magnet and another magnet, and I've made a little tool. I cut off a piece of the metal from the side, and basically what I'm going to do is shove it up in there. All right, now I've got a perfect 1/16 of an inch or a 20 gauge gap on 20 gauge steel that was pretty quick and easy. The advantage of these panel clamps over top of just setting it with a gauge is that this is not going to keep it from moving like this. These clamps will. So if you're in a pinch, this is a nice way to get the same gap throughout the course of your weld. So let's do a little butt weld. So I'm going to start and tack, just like I said in the diagram. Tack on this side, and in the middle. I'll get rid of my clamps, and then we'll finish it out. All right, helmets down, let's burn. Okay, all right, time to tell the truth. Look at this. Dive in with this, Ken. You see what happened? Okay, I blew a giant nasty hole in there. You know why? I didn't check my machine. I'm still set for 16 gauge or 14 gauge metal. So now what I'm going to do is verify again. I'm going to go back to 25 thousandths, 20 gauge E5. So we're back to E, and I'm way back down to 5. My wire speed was just killing it. It was like I was at Bristol or something. Okay, so we're now back at E5. And we're going to try this again. All right, helmets down. There's a nice little tack. On the other side. My gap's a little wide. I've got to tune this in a bit. Yeah, we're a little bit hot there. Okay, my other tack is holding that in. If you guys have any questions, even about this, all right, what's happened here is I've established a wider gap on the other side, and we're fighting it. All right, so pull the clamps off. I'll go back to plan A. Infinite adjustability. I'm going to go back a little bit on my voltage. I'm going to keep my wire speed up. That should give me a little more substantial pull. We're going to tack again. All right, that's what I wanted to see. If you take a look at that tack, there's none of the blow through like I had here, and it was a welder setting issue. I just backed off the speed just a little bit. So let's continue. We go to the middle. All right. Now we've got studio lights in here, and the sensitivity, which is a nice thing to be able to adjust, was a little too high. Before I go much further, I'm going to clean up a little bit. And we'll keep on splitting the difference in that distance. And you get the picture. Basically what I'm doing is creating a continuous weld, one tack at a time. But I'm allowing the metal to cool to the point to where it's not looking like, it's not curled up, it's not all distorted, it's fairly flat. We have some warpage, but you know, you're just going to get that with heat being introduced into it. Eventually, you want a butt weld that's continuous, and then you can dress it down, add your fillers if necessary. Let's talk about one of the most common welds that you're going to run into in panel replacement is called a rosette weld or a spot weld or a plug weld. Now in the factories, these cars were made with an electric spot welder. It's fusing the metal together and creating an electric arc. Now on restoration work, you've got a couple of different ways of recreating that. You can drill holes or punch holes and weld up your pools like this, or even fuse them together just by penetrating all the way through. The traditional way of doing that is really quite simple. You can jig up your weld, and what I like to do is start right about here, find the edge, and kind of travel around it. And then sort of come back into the middle. And that, instead of blowing through the center, it allows me to work off of that edge and fill it in the hole, and what you end up with is something like that. So let's try one. We'll let that guy cool down a little bit. Let's look at the back side of it. You can see we've got a nice heat affected zone. There's good penetration on it. It's bubbled up slightly, but that's a decent way to approach that weld. And I haven't blown through anywhere. But there's a tendency sometimes, as you can see, right here, you see where that edge is blown just a little bit? You know, we run the risk of that. We run the risk of a torn edge or leaving an open spot in that weld. And that, you know, makes you have to go back and tack it again. Sometimes it's not the best thing. You're basically improvising and you're drawing a circle around your plugged hole. Well, Eastwood has come out with a cool system. I want to show it to you. It's basically an attachment that you screw off your cover off of your wand, and you can see what this guy does. You see the edges on it. It's quite literally a depth gauge. Goes back on exactly the same way. And see what it does. Let me trim. When I put my wand down, it gives me the perfect distance for a really nice rosette weld. And it makes pretty good sense why that works. Now, on the 135 machine, or actually with this kit, comes these drills, which is the correct diameter to do a really, really nice, tasty spot weld, which, as you'll notice, is smaller than this diameter. That's a 3/8 hole. This is not 3/8. I'm not going to spout out the distance because I don't know it by heart, but it's obviously smaller. You'll still get a nice enough weld, but it's just a little bit different. If you've got the 135 welder, you can pre-drill your holes in your top panel and do as I've done here and fill in that hole, fill in the pool like that. But if you've got the 175, like we're using here, what you can do is you don't have to drill a hole, and you can still get great penetration. Keep in mind, you've got to clamp your panels together. So the other part of this kit are these pliers. Check these pliers. These pliers are designed to clamp the two pieces together. You can see what I'm doing here. We're clamping these two pieces together. It keeps everything locked in. And by the way, I'm going to set this up, and there's a question that I'm going to answer. There's a couple of questions that we're going to address. That's the cool thing about doing these live streams. But even though there's no hole, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to create a rosette weld right here before your very eyes. That's probably the best position for me right there. So we're on the same setting for 20 gauge, and here we go. As you can see, it's a nice looking weld. It looks really, really good. We'll unclamp. We'll flip it over. And viola. You can see by the raised portion we've got penetration into the second sheet of metal, and we didn't have to drill a hole. So with the extra horsepower of the 175, you can just clamp your panels together and you can get a really, really nice, very effective plug weld without a whole lot of work. That's a neat tool. Again, thanks, Eastwood. All right, I'm going to take about a 30-second pause here and look at some of these questions. We've got I'm a little behind in the questions. We're working with computers. What a world. What a wonderful world we live in, to where I don't have to come to your shop, you can come to mine. This is cool. Do you use a backer when filling a blown hole in a panel? Yes, good question. A backer is a great tool. These are backers, they're copper, they're magnetic, so when you're setting up your gap, you can use a backer, and that stops the heat, and it stops it from blowing out sideways as well as from going down. So a nice backer can help you in controlling or eliminating a blow-through. Great question. Okay, here's another one. What's the best way to fill a hole when you've blown through into a panel? Well, it goes back to what I was talking about before with timid welding. You weld off of your weld pool because that weld pool is this thick and your sheet metal is this thick. So what you don't want to do is take advantage of that capacity of that weld pool to handle more heat, to handle more filling wire, and to fuse by fooling the metal into working together. Just like the, here. Well, I tossed it. No, here it is. Okay. Just like this, just like going from a heavy gauge to a light gauge with no blow through, welding off of your weld pool on a blown through panel on a butt weld is precisely how you do that. You weld off your pool into the blown area, off your pool into the blown area. Again, basically bridging and sort of fooling the area into fusing together like you want it to fuse. We've got another question. Okay, the other question is, should the gap of the butt weld be about the same as the sheet metal gauge that you're using? And the answer to that is yes, except for the fact that sometimes on your heavier gauges, particularly with the smaller gauge wire, you can have the tendency to create too much gap. I want enough gap to where my wire can go in and actually fill both pieces of metal rather than bridge over top. So it's a great question. Yes, you should start out with the same gauge gap that you're welding, but if you find yourself blowing through, you can tighten it up just a little bit and you can adjust. And again, play with the settings on the welder. When you've got a great welder like this, then you can back off your heat just a little bit, or you can increase your wire speed just a little bit, and both don't really do the same thing, but they will adjust your weld pool and allow you to control it instead of the metal controlling you. The next question was dealing with brand new metal against old rusty metal. Now, if you're putting a patch panel on a car, you're going to run into this. So again, I sound like a parrot, but it's kind of the same technique. You're using the new metal to drag your pool into the other one. That's another great situation for these backers. Now, if you have access to the back of the panel to not only put these on as well as to retrieve them, well, that's a good thing. If you don't, Eastwood has another tool. This is a handheld version of the same thing. This is copper, so it's not going to stick to your MIG weld, and it's got a nice handle. So if I'm behind a quarter panel and the wheel arch is here, I can put this guy in. Heck, I can even tape a stick to it, and I can get it in behind my butt weld, even though I can't get to it with, you know, with a backing panel to where I can get off. I can poke it in there and cheat my way into it and drag it across as I'm welding from the outside. So there's a bunch of different tools at your disposal that will allow you to do the same thing. And the copper also acts as a heat sink. So it dissipates the heat. It doesn't eliminate it, but it takes it away from the weld pool and makes it a little less aggressive. I think we've got another question up. Okay, so far we're caught up. So that yeah, that gets us there. So we've talked about a butt weld. We've talked about the spot welds, and we've shown you a bunch of techniques. And I'm going to clean up my desktop just a little bit. Here's another necessary item, by the way. This is just an old pair of channel lock cutters. These guys, right on hand, even in a tool belt, in your pocket, they'll allow you to trim your wire. What happens? There's a tendency, we'll put this back. There's a tendency, when you finish a weld, maybe you've got a little bit of wire sticking out. Well, a lazy technique is to just go ahead and pop that off on your ground clamp or on the substrate, but it's not the best thing to do. You're worried about the wire and not the weld. So get your 1/4 inch with your pliers instead of popping it off on the metal. That's just a good common safety practice. So now that we've prepped with our practice panels of a similar gauge, let's start the real thing. What we've got here is a fender. That's from an old Ford Ranger. This is a late model fender. We know that it's 20 gauge because I've found a place on the fender to use my metal gauge and figure out how thick it is. So now we know that our 20 gauge settings on the welder will work with this panel. Ken, come a little bit closer here. I want to see if you can see the difference here. This is something that's just sort of an oh by the way, but you can see where I've ground out here. Now, if you see the dissimilar color, you guys that have run into this in body shops know the difference. But what the OEs are doing now that is actually a really good idea is that they're electroplating zinc. They're e-coating zinc on top of the sheet metal. It works great for corrosion. However, when you weld that, when you burn that, the smoke that comes off of that zinc, well, it's quite toxic. So you want to be aware, you want to be careful. For instance, if I'm suited up and I'm welding right here, because I do recommend you get in close and get in where you can look. If I've got my glasses on and I'm suited up and welded up and I'm right here, what's that smoke doing? It's coming up into my welding helmet and I'm breathing it in. You always want to be aware of taking care of your respiratory system. As a painter, it's really, really critical. But you can damage yourself and you can hurt yourself with welding too. So just be aware, late model sheet metal typically has zinc on it. Back into the prep techniques, a great way to get rid of the zinc is using an angle grinder with a twist lock disc on the top. It's not sandpaper, it's an abrasive fiber, kind of like a Scotch-Brite pad or a scuffing pad with an adhesive in it with grit on the fibers. And it's not going to profile the metal, it's not going to grind the metal out, but it's going to really clean, and it'll get rid of that zinc coating in no time. Okay, I'm going to clamp my workpiece here. And this is an old fender, so I don't care about it. But I don't want it to fall on the floor, because that would be embarrassing. Okay. All right. We're just gonna say it's gonna stay here. Check this out. You see how easy that is to bend? You can see. Yeah, he's getting a great camera shot. You see how flimsy that metal is? I can bend that with the tip of one finger. How does that happen? That's 20 gauge metal. And look at this. This stamping is 20 gauge. It's the same 20 gauge, but man alive, you try and bend that, you're not going to do it. It's the same gauge metal, but I can't bend it with one finger when I can bend that with one finger. The reason is that that's stamped. There are corners and edges that give that metal strength. Just as this style line here, yes, it's aesthetic. Yes, it makes this Ranger look good, but it gives strength. It gives strength here, in here, in here. It lends strength to this dome. It lends strength to this dome. Rather than just a smooth panel, it's building strength to it. Yes, it's aesthetically pleasing, but there's a reason for that as well, is because it's giving you strength here, and it's making this to where it will withstand a little more pressure and a little more heat. Now that's a long gap. Yes, I can move it, but not nearly as much as I can move this stuff down here. So now what I'm doing, and we're just about to wrap this up, guys. Now what I'm doing is I'm clamping to the fender, and we're going to have some fun. I'm going to come around the front. And there's my helmet. So I've got two gaps here. What we're going to do, I'm just going to pour the coal to it. We'll see what happens. I'd like to see what I'm doing, so I'm going to put my glasses on. Okay, yes, it's welded, it's domed up, it's distorted, and I've created a whole lot of work for myself. When jumping across and creating a path for the heat to escape rather than a path for the metal to fuse the other two pieces together would have really saved me a lot of work after the fact, and quite frankly, saved this project from a lot of filler that it didn't actually need. So the point being is some of these techniques that we've shown you, when you apply them to a project, they really start to make sense. So take some of the techniques that we've shown you, get onto the online forums, really dive into the education part of this, guys. Educate yourselves, practice on pieces, not your project, and you're going to have success. Yes, there's a learning curve, but with the help of online resources like the Eastwood Company, and quite frankly, with the help of really good tools that take that out of the equation, you can educate yourselves and you can have success. There's training guides all over the place. The paint education DVDs are a nice part, but more importantly, talk to people and just practice, practice, practice. Practice your rehearsal zones, your comfort zone, your muscle memory will kick in, and you're eventually going to have great success. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and if we've got any more questions, I'm sure they're going to come up. But in the meantime, log on to Eastwood. This video will be viewable later on, and you'll be able to review this, to take these questions and ask more questions if it inspires you for something else that you're wanting to know. But this is certainly not the last live stream that we're going to do. Matt and the guys at Eastwood are doing them on a regular basis, so keep tuning in and keep learning. I'm Kevin Tetz, and I just want to say thanks for tuning in and having some fun with me, and I hope we've passed on some stuff that are going to help you with your project.